It's been a couple days since I returned home from the road, and I don't really have anything else prepared. So I've pulled out one of the episode ideas that I've had sort of in my back pocket for a while, and now seems as good a time as any, especially because I'm recording the episode the day I'm releasing it, and it's already coming out late. So at least I'm getting it out on Tuesday, but this is probably record time for putting an episode together and recording it, because as you'll see when I release the documentary or movie or whatever you want to call it, probably I'll release it as a video podcast, but definitely on the YouTube channel. When I release the movie documenting the tour we just did, you'll understand why I haven't had a whole lot of time. I'd planned on working on some of the Nietzsche podcast while I was out on the road, but that didn't happen. But so, better to keep it simple. I'm under the gun to put out content. And I think this passage, more importantly, will help bring us back down to earth a little bit, given the grand ideas that we've discussed recently on the podcast. So today we're going to look at a passage from Nietzsche's Daybreak, which is sometimes translated as The Dawn. It's one of my favorite books by Nietzsche's. I'm sure you're all sick of me saying that about all sorts of different books by Nietzsche, because it probably changes from week to week. But this is one of the more fascinating passages in Nietzsche, because it approximates something akin to advice for day-to-day living. And that's something that some might find lacking in Nietzsche if all they've read from him are his works, Beyond Good and Evil, or Thus Spoke Zarathustra, or even like Genealogy of Morality, books that are concerned with the big questions, such as the nature of truth and, the basis of our entire European morality, the recreation of sacred value in the wake of God's death, and so on. Or the Overman, the topic we just finished covering in depth. So instead, this section in Nietzsche's work is what we might call practical ethics. And this passage follows from the ideas that Nietzsche has carved out during this period of his career, which do carry into his later work, but the main idea being of man not as a unitary being, but a concatenation of impulses and physiological drives, subconscious psychological needs, and competing values, competing interests, sometimes contrasting or even conflicting motives, which can act against one another, even within the same person. Zarathustra gives a somewhat poetic explanation of this view of the human being in the passage, Despisers of the Body, which is a section we have discussed before, but we'll go over a few lines from that chapter anyway, as a refresher. Because in this passage, Nietzsche states, in the clearest possible terms, how he means to invert the relationship between mind and body, or in Christian terms, body and soul. Rather than the mind or the soul as the rational governor, this is what we would today call the ego consciousness, Nietzsche wishes to put the body in charge in our perception of ourselves. The body is supreme, the mind is simply one of the body's many functions. The image that then necessarily emerges is the image of a self which is not a unity but a multiplicity. And so it's a multivaried view of one's self-identity, because all the various drives within the body are not in any sense identical. The individual is not reducible to any one of these impulses. The individual cannot be found in any one of them. Rather, what we can say that what each drive or impulse, or whatever you want to call it, represents is what we might call will, a desire, an aim, a movement towards a certain goal. The nature of things that will is, of course, each thing that wills often comes into conflict with other things, with mutually exclusive wills, producing, as we said, conflict. And so the conflict in nature, the strife that characterizes all reality, it's not just something that's external out in the world, but it takes place within the individual as a biological imperative, Nietzsche might say, created by the many competing wills within each of us, because each impulse will have its own will, so to speak. And so in Despisers of the Body, we get this pair of couplets, which I think sums this up very nicely. Quote, "The awakened one, the knowing one says, Body am I entirely, and nothing more. The soul is only the name of something in the body. The body is a great wisdom, a plurality with one sense, a war and a peace, a flock and a shepherd." End quote. I think that conveys a great depth of meaning that I could talk about for a whole episode, but we've already done basically a whole episode on this view of the self. And so if you're interested in more on this, you can look at episode 9. But I think if we accept this view of the self as a multiplicity, we come away with an idea of our own identity, which is probably a bit challenging for many to fully comprehend, because it's not essentialized or totally consistent. Just as language deceives us, it falsifies the world by equating unequal things, we make identical, non-identical things within the self, classifying it all as me, and then we try to make sense of all the apparent contradictions that then arise when we do that. But if what I am is not one thing, that's the same as when I wake up in the morning as when I go to bed at night, but actually has no consistent identity, and it changes, it remains dynamic, such that I'm not the same person in the morning as I am in the evening. Not to speak of 10 years down the line, there are very serious implications for this in terms of the practical sphere, in terms of practical ethics, as I said, that we're talking about. I know I've referred to it before, but T.S. Eliot wrote of this sort of view of the dynamic self very beautifully in his poem Four Quartets, which I don't think I've ever read from, so I'll take the opportunity to read from it here. Quote, "You cannot face it steadily, but this thing is sure, that time is no healer, the patient is no longer here. When the train starts and the passengers are settled to fruit, periodicals, and business letters, and those who saw them off have left the platform, their faces relax from grief into relief to the sleepy rhythm of 100 hours. Fare forward, travelers, not escaping from the past into different lives or into any future. You are not the same people who left that station or who will arrive at any terminus." End quote. So the person who came into the train, who sits down in the train car at the beginning of the journey, is not the same person. That's why time is no healer, because the patient is no longer here. He's refuting the idea that time heals all wounds. How can time heal anything? Because it's a very odd view of it's sort of the illusion of duration, as we talked about with Heraclitus, right? It's a rejection of being. It almost becomes difficult to talk about because all of our language is based on these essentialized categories of being. This is another aspect of Buddhism where we actually find agreement with Nietzsche, this view of the self, in contradistinction to the Christians. So the Buddhists believe that the self is simply constructed of aggregates or heaps, which are known as skandhas or kundas, depending on your tradition or the language, that there's no self-same identical quality to all of these various aggregates, rather that we simply bundle together cognition, form, sensation, perception, and consciousness. We do this as a sort of linguistic convention designed to make sense of chaotic becoming and transform it into stable being, instead of an immortal soul, which is the thing with like a spiritual essence, apart from the endlessly transforming flux of becoming, right? Spirit is, ironically enough, the one thing that truly is in the Western spiritual traditions, because to truly be anything is to be free from impermanence, to be free from constant changes, right? Because as T.S. Eliot points out, if you are not the same person from moment to moment, if the person who comes into the doctor's office is not the same person who leaves, then we can't say that time heals all wounds or that anyone can be healed, for example. I'm just using the metaphor that he uses yet again. And so in this world where duration is merely an illusion. That's why you see in a lot of mystical traditions, that's why God is the one thing that truly is, especially in the esoteric and mystical revelations in the West. And the higher spiritual revelation that somebody like Meister Eckhart comes to is like a total communion, total unity with the Godhead. Nietzsche's big problem with this, of course, is that, so if we're going to say that we live in this existence of becoming, that's what characterizes our existence, that we actually experience and live within. If we then make our standard of being such that the only thing that qualifies is spirit, that it has to be this consistent, coherent, permanent, essentialized thing, then we've made the one thing that truly is something that exists purely in opposition to matter, as that which is immaterial, right? It's very famously hard to define spirit. One of the ways we can define it is that it's immaterial. But Nietzsche would point out, in actuality, the way it actually lives is it only exists within our imagination. It's not something we perceive in the world we actually have to live in. And so this is why Nietzsche said that Buddhism, it's one of the reasons why Nietzsche said Buddhism is 1,000 times more logical than Christianity. It can acknowledge some of these basic truths about life and the human condition that Christianity cannot. Or rather, it acknowledges them. We might say that Christianity also acknowledges that we live in a world of impermanence and suffering, right? But then tries to imagine a world of permanence and bliss that we can escape into. Buddhism addresses itself very plainly to simply the problem of living within the world of becoming. As Nietzsche says, it addresses itself directly to the problem of suffering and doesn't layer on the problem of sin, right? And so throughout Christianity, we can sort of see this layering on of this imagined spiritual reality. But Buddhism ultimately tries to reconcile itself to the fact that we live in this world of impermanence and emptiness, and therefore non-identity of all things, and ultimately this sort of dissatisfactoriness of existence. These are all arguably enough necessitated by the conditions of a world characterized by becoming. And Nietzsche is familiar with all this through the arguments of Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer, he finds in this world of becoming, we don't find any reason to believe in the existence of anything like a spirit or a spiritual world or a benevolent, all-powerful creator God. And without that, life becomes something that is doesn't ever get beyond never-ending suffering and dissatisfaction. And why is that? Because the final resting place, the state of contentment, the perfection of a person, the moral perfection of a person, or the idea of dwelling in eternal bliss, these all become sort of like dreams and fairy tales. Everything is dynamic. There is no final state. Notice all of those things I mentioned are sort of this final state of eternality that Christianity imagines. But in this world as will, change always recurs again. Transformations are inevitable and endless. And so that's why Schopenhauer interprets Buddhism and spirituality. He believes the actual goal of the spiritual life is not some higher realm, right? But the negation of the will, and thus the negation of the world. The real goal is nothingness. He says at the end of his book, The Secret of All the Ascetics, as explicated in the Buddhist doctrine of nirvana, even though Schopenhauer says we shouldn't even call it that. It's the extinguishment of the flame of desire, no longer becoming or manifesting one's karma in the material world, becoming liberated. Without saying we're being liberated into this world of eternality, Schopenhauer looks for the opposite, eternal nothingness, so to speak. Nietzsche, of course, takes the opposite stance. If this life, if this world of becoming is all there is, then that's what we ought to affirm. If it's our fate to live out our existence here, we ought to bless that existence. If we're going to have to confront suffering inherent to that existence, we should do it with wholehearted acceptance. And again, this is something, if you want to know more about this, we talked about all this before in the talks about Schopenhauer and Nietzsche. But the relevance to this episode is that the Buddhists provide a perfect example of how one might approach the moral problems of humanity outside of the framework of essentialized being, or outside of metaphysical superstitions. which is how Nietzsche might have characterized the Western means of attacking our moral problems. The Buddhists are willing to not try to invent some means of getting out of this world of becoming while answering the problems of becoming. That's what I think we could find useful about the Buddhists into looking at their framework for how they view the self. And it's probably why Nietzsche praises Schopenhauer's honesty and saw so much value in Schopenhauer, because so much of his work is simply a secularization of Buddhism. But we run into this moral problem of mankind, or the problem of practical ethics that we've been talking about, that I mentioned could be sort of difficult in this world where there is no consistent, coherent self, right? The moral problem of mankind, I would say, first and foremost, is the problem of the stubborn will, or the vehemence of the will, we can call it. This is the problem that every religion has had to answer in some fashion. And I believe I brought up this passage before as well, but this is from Romans, and this is in the words of St. Paul, quote, "To will is present with me, but how to do good I find not. For the good that I would do, I do not, and the evil that I would not, that I do." End quote. So it's somewhat absurdly straightforward terms, but Paul puts forward the problem that mankind has. It's something of a paradox or a mystery, especially when we take on the implications of the free will doctrine, which sort of goes hand in hand with the idea of the soul. Because again, Paul's coming from the Christian background, who he's right there at the beginning of the Christian worldview. If the soul is this thing divorced from the body, divorced from the causality that governs physical things, separate from the laws of nature, able to act independently, the problem we face when we imagine ourselves as these voluntarily governing souls, or minds with the power of libertarian free will, is that then in daily life we run into the problem that I think I could put it as straightforwardly as this: thought doesn't control desire. So what happens in the ordinary experience of many people is that we come to think that we ought to desire something. Maybe another way to say it is thought doesn't control will. And so we come to will something. Or in many cases, we maybe think that we ought not to will something, or we ought not to desire something. Perhaps we want to obey that ancient Greek maxim, all things in moderation, and rein in a powerful desire that we're indulging in total excess. Like the obvious example to use would be drinking in modern day, Western world, or overindulgence in food, especially high caloric American junk food. A lot of people struggle with smoking. Some would say any amount of smoking is too much, but maybe you have a problem with women or with men, or getting your heart broken, or too many sexual encounters, or not enough, or you want to save more money, or maybe you want to just spend less of your time and effort on short-term temporary pleasures and invest more into the long term. Whatever it is, the experience that people have all the time is that when they make that decision and they commit to it, they find they can't do it, that they don't have the willpower. And what does this mean exactly, to say I didn't have the willpower? It's actually kind of a very interesting phrase, because if you don't have the willpower to do something, can you will yourself to have it? And feeling that one's will is wayward from the way one thinks one's will should behave can produce the strange experience that one's sort of at war with themselves, or in conflict internally. And I mean, we all know in our common parlance to speak of having an internal conflict. But when we reflect on that, I think, for a moment, it's very easy to see how that's sort of at odds with the view of the self as a unity. I remember listening to a Radiolab podcast one time where they were talking to a woman who was a longtime smoker and her struggles with quitting. And as I recall, she went as far to personify this internal struggle with her and her own willpower. And so she committed to quit smoking. She made a promise to do so to one of her friends. But then she caught herself saying to herself, well, it's not my fault if she smokes again. And the she in that sentence refers to herself, to the impulse, the craving, the desire to keep smoking. And that's how people experience that contradiction, a literal other personality within them. That's only a mystery, really, within the ego consciousness as governor model, or the soul model, really, the libertarian free will model. If we take the Nietzschean view of the self, the idea that each drive has its own subpersonality, its own will, even its own form of logic, its own feelings, which, we can be made to indirectly think or feel, right? This idea seems to be not only perfectly comprehensible, or this idea of this personified other, but it's almost demanded by that picture of the self that we're now working from. It's notable that Carl Jung, influenced by Nietzsche, went on to develop something resembling this view of the self, insofar as he postulates that we're a network or complex of subpersonalities. Even on the deepest level, we don't find the foundation of a single essentialized entity, right? But it's a catacomb filled with archetypes and all sorts of subconscious monsters and religious and physiological baggage dating back to ancient times. And so, in short, the old view of the self, the Christian view, which we've nevertheless carried over into modern times and our habits of thinking, is the ego consciousness as governor. That's a coherent being with an essence, which can therefore be justifiably held accountable for its past actions. That's one side effect of this, and thus be owed praise or blame, or be said to be deserving in a moral sense. And so we've talked about this in our episode on free will as well. Morality in practical terms, I would say, what I'm sort of coming to with this, it becomes a frustratingly abstract exercise in trying to search for willpower. We all wish to have the better angels of our nature win in the end. There's another personification for you, right? The devil and the angel on the shoulder. But along with St. Paul, how to do good we find not. The will is ever wayward. The vast majority of mankind, anyway, it will experience this. And so what conclusion does Christianity, for example, ultimately draw? That sinfulness is universal and insurmountable, and that the only salvation is from the grace of God. So ultimately, Christianity gives up the fight to improve mankind. It cedes that argument in the final perspective. Christianity admits the devil rules this world, impermanence and corruption rule the world. That means perfection comes later, after death. So Christianity therefore gives up on virtue, in the Greek sense, in the old sense. Christianity finds the questions of virtue quite unanswerable. And in fact, in the Christian framework, they're a bit incomprehensible. Because how to do good we find not. We find man's will to be small, short-term, selfish, irredeemable. The only redemption, therefore, is to give up yourself to a higher power, something above mankind. I first heard that quotation from St. Paul from Alan Watts, by the way, who I've mentioned in some interviews, I think. And Alan Watts is actually a perfect example, I think, to drive home this eternal moral problem. Because Watts, as many of you know, was both a profoundly insightful person, a guru, a man who served as a bridge between Western philosophy and Eastern philosophy, between Western and Eastern religion, and who helped many people, and still helps many people today through his recordings, to find some sort of reprieve from the pathological anxiety and depression in Western society. But Watts, in actuality, was in his personal life an insatiable alcoholic. And by the last decade of his life, he drank whiskey by the bottle, putting himself into a mindless stupor by the end of every night. Some have charitably compared this habit of Watts to the drunkenness of the Taoist masters of legend. But it's difficult not to see some contradiction in the fact that Watts spoke of liberating ourselves from karma, from desire, from selfishness, and so on. And yet his addiction compelled him to continue to indulge in excessive behavior to the point that it killed him. And so, in spite of the fact there have been various views of the self, both Western and Eastern, philosophical and religious, that are adequate to various degrees or inadequate to various degrees, the fact remains that we don't really know how to use our conscious thought to take control of the body and its drives. And what Nietzsche believed, on account of this, is that it is in fact always some drive which is in control. That thought merely accompanies the process of some drive or another taking charge of the human organism. Rather than believing this to be some pessimistic or depressing view of human life, though, Nietzsche did not see this as akin to being enslaved or enchained by our impulses, as we are often want to believe when we hear such a view of the self. Because you would only feel this way if you come to self-identify with the ego consciousness and reject the impulses and the body as just a vessel for you to control. Instead of this, Nietzsche believes we are the drives. We are this community of impulses, this war and this peace, the shepherd and the flock, one sense and a multiplicity. The drives are the leading string of the notions of the consciousness, and it's for the sake of these competing wills that we experience pleasure, pain, feelings such as fulfillment or disappointment, and so on. And our thoughts, and yes, even our feelings, are secondary. And so that's why he says they're not the criteria by which we should judge existence or the level at which we should evaluate existence. And so for Nietzsche, the will becomes primary. The question becomes whether one possesses a strong or weak will. And at this time, when he was writing Daybreak, he didn't really have the conception of will to power fully realized, but we can see how his conception of the human being as governed by these competing wills sort of gives way to that idea, right? It's consistent with that idea. It's one of the things that clued him into that idea. But what does it mean to be a strong will? And he's toying with that notion even here in Daybreak. But according to all the considerations we've made about the self, a strong will would be, the relevant question is, so you exist in this multiplicity. Is it a multiplicity that is ordered, in which the smaller drives, the best example would be, are the short-term impulses subservient to the greater ones, to the long-term goals? That's what we might describe in a rough outline as a strong person. A person in which the competing drives are organized in accord with a single will or a single aim, or the fewest organizing principles possible is what will produce the strongest individual. Although Nietzsche also talks about juxtaposed characters where they have two really strong competing drives, and sometimes this produces people like Goethe or so on and so forth. But, that kind of thing he describes as being a very difficult and dangerous existence that most people are not strong enough for, right? And so we find no coherence or consistency in the makeup of the what you might call the stuff of the self. We find no consistency in the self across time. Nietzsche basically says that's where we find identity, though, where we find self-creation, as in the creation of a coherent will. The will is the thing that's coherent. The power and the organizing force that is our goal, that is what the self is. And so that's what you are. What you are is the aim, the goal towards which you act. You are a dynamic pattern, a flowing thing which is transforming, but it has to transform in a certain direction at a given time. It's therefore not who you are in any one state or in any one moment that matters, or who defines you, but the pattern itself, the direction, the shape of the transformations, or we might say the whole story. So finding this strength to govern oneself and to give that direction, that's what he says is needful for us. That's what Nietzsche in his later work would call becoming a master of one's passions, or what he would call in the gay science, giving style to one's character. And so this consequent view of what practical morality looks like is a great start, but oftentimes even this remains a little too abstract for most of us to make use of, because what does it mean to strengthen or to lessen an impulse, or to bring everything, all your drives within one organizing pattern? How does one go about doing that, right? And so that's the topic of the passage we're discussing. Daybreak 109, it's called Self-Control and Moderation and Their Final Motive. There's a lot of background reading and background information that will be useful in understanding this, but thankfully most of that groundwork is already there in the previous episodes of the podcast. And so hopefully, those are there and you're familiar with them, or the introduction I've given will suffice for those of you who are brand new to this. So, Nietzsche begins the passage by addressing himself to the problem of combating the vehemence of an impulse. So this is the problem we've been considering. We wish for one impulse to be in charge, or we think, we feel that we should will something, but then we find a competing drive is actually in charge, or is insurmountable. And so we wish for the intellect to be able to give the order for the impulse to desist, but sadly that's a fantasy version of how the self exists and how the intellect exists in relation to it. And so Nietzsche in this passage sets out to give us 6 ways to control or combat a drive that is sort of beyond that fantasy version of how things work. He's looking for what are the actual practical methods, if we're not just going to throw up our hands and say, well, you just need more willpower, or we'll think our way out of it, or something like that. And so this is a long passage. I'll read the entire thing for you first, and then we'll go through and take it section by section with my commentary. Okay, Daybreak 109, self-control and moderation and their final motive. Quote, I find not more than 6 essentially different methods for combating the vehemence of an impulse. First of all, we may avoid the occasion for satisfying the impulse, weakening and mortifying it by restraining from satisfying it for long and ever-lengthening periods. Secondly, we may impose a severe and regular order upon ourselves in regard to the satisfying of our appetites. By thus regulating the impulse and limiting its ebb and flow to fixed periods, we may obtain intervals in which it ceases to disturb us, and by beginning in this way, we may perhaps be able to pass on to the first method. In the third place, we may deliberately give ourselves over to an unrestrained and unbounded gratification of the impulse in order that we may become disgusted with it, and to obtain by means of this very disgust a command over the impulse, provided, of course, that we do not imitate the rider who rides his horse to death and breaks his own neck in doing so. For this, unhappily, is generally the outcome of the application of this third method. In the fourth place, there is an intellectual trick which consists in associating the idea of the gratification so firmly with some painful thought that after a little practice, the thought of gratification is itself immediately felt as a very painful one. For example, when the Christian accustoms himself to think of the presence and scorn of the devil in the course of sensual enjoyment, or everlasting punishment in hell for revenge by murder, or even merely of the contempt which he will meet with from those of his fellow men whom he most respects if he steals a sum of money, or if a man has often checked an intense desire for suicide by thinking of the grief and self-reproaches of his relations and friends, and has thus succeeded in balancing himself upon the edge of life. For after some practice, these ideas follow one another in his mind like cause and effect. Among instances of this kind may be mentioned the cases of Lord Byron and Napoleon, in whom the pride of man revolted and took offense at the preponderance of one particular passion over the collective attitude and order of reason. From this arises the habit and joy of tyrannizing over the craving and making it, as it were, gnash its teeth. I will not be a slave of any appetite, wrote Byron in his diary. In the fifth place, we may bring about a dislocation of our powers by imposing upon ourselves a particularly difficult and fatiguing task, or by deliberately submitting to some new charm and pleasure in order thus to turn our thoughts and physical powers into other channels. It comes to the same thing if we temporarily favor another impulse by affording it numerous opportunities of gratification, and thus rendering it the squanderer of the power which would otherwise be commandeered, so to speak, by the tyrannical impulse. A few, perhaps, will be able to restrain the particular passion which aspires to domination by granting their other known passions a temporary encouragement and license, in order that they may devour the food which the tyrant wishes for himself alone. In the sixth and last place, the man who can stand it, and thinks it reasonable to weaken and subdue his entire physical and psychical organization likewise, of course, attains the goal of weakening a single violent instinct, as, for example, those who starve their sensuality and at the same time their vigor and often destroy their reason into the bargain, such as the ascetics. Hence, shunning the opportunities, regulating the impulse, bringing about satiety and disgust in the impulse, associating a painful idea, such as that of discredit, disgust, or offended pride, and then the dislocation of one's forces, and finally, general debility and exhaustion. These are the 6 methods. But the will to combat the violence of a craving is beyond our power, equally with the method we adopt and the success we may have in applying it. In all this process, our intellect is rather merely the blind instrument of another rival craving, whether it be the impulse to repose, or the fear of disgrace and other evil consequences, or love. While we thus imagine that we are complaining of the violence of an impulse, it is at bottom merely one impulse which is complaining of another, i.e., the perception of the violent suffering which is being caused us presupposes that there is another equally or more violent impulse, and that a struggle is impending, in which our intellect must take part. End quote. Okay, so now we will go section by section in the passage. Quote, I find not more than 6 essentially different methods for combating the vehemence of an impulse. First of all, we may avoid the occasion for satisfying the impulse, weakening and mortifying it by refraining from satisfying it for long and ever-lengthening periods. End quote. So, avoiding the impulse altogether, that's strategy number 1. That seems relatively straightforward. We might call it an approach by brute force, maybe. But I think we should note this is not simply an incitement to resist temptation, right? Nietzsche is saying avoid it altogether. Make it such that you don't even have the ability or the opportunity for fulfilling an impulse. This can be as simple as removing yourself from society at large to a more controlled environment. So when someone checks themselves into rehab, that's somebody using method 1. They're saying, I have to avoid the occasion for satisfying this impulse. I need to be around people who will actively stop me from doing this. It's because I cannot resist. I can't find the willpower to resist, so I'm going to use method 1. Another example, maybe, remember Jordan Peterson talking about this, like some of his patients who are drug addicts, that the worst thing for them was when they came into some money, because then they had money to buy drugs. But if they were broke, if they were forced by their circumstances to not have the ability to indulge in the behavior, then they couldn't do it, right? An example of this kind of mentality on a society-wide scale could be the religion of Islam, or the Sharia, right? The continuing theme of Islamic morality is the theme of submission to Allah, obedience to the law of God, and the moral customs of the religion, such as the legal prohibition on alcohol or the veiling of women. They're designed with the idea in mind that the opportunity for temptation should never arise in the first place. Resisting temptation is great and all, but as we've been discussing, people are weak. People can't resist temptation in general. So if you really want people not to drink, then make drinking, or even the possession or sale of alcohol, punishable by death, right? So granted, that's particularly hardline interpretation of Sharia. I'm not saying all Muslims are in favor of that. But if you look throughout the Muslim world, and in fact, in attitudes of Muslims even in the West, prohibitions on alcohol and veiling of women, at least in some fashion, seem fairly universal. I'm not bringing this up to take a moral issue with this, by the way, or to argue against it or say why it's wrong. That's not really the point. I'm pointing out these prohibitions operate from the presupposition of that first strategy of Nietzsche's for combating a vehement drive. If you look at the nature of human beings, you could easily conclude that the sexual impulse, for example, is often a vehement one. The vehemence of this impulse is a source of conflict within societies, right? Jealousy, adultery, sexual libertinism, even, sexual assault and violence. These are real problems. And so there's a certain logic to saying, rather than trusting people to manage their sexual impulse in a responsible way, we're going to use this first strategy for combating a vehement drive. No, just veil one of the genders. Make it so you don't really see their features. Make it so the men can make no comparisons between the appearances of the women. Put a control on, or a regulating effect on the sexual impulse through the force of law. And law in general, in every society that has existed, is an example of how we attempt to remove the opportunity for fulfilling certain impulses. We don't trust individuals to resist temptation. We use the threat of force. But importantly, it's not just because you might say, well, that sounds sort of like Nietzsche's fourth method, and we'll talk about that obviously when we get to it in the passage of bringing to mind the negative consequences to associate it with an action. But it's not really the threat of force that compels every individual in every moment, right? It's that, like, you can't go buy meth at a grocery store. The law removes the opportunity for your average person to have the choice to buy meth just happen upon them in their daily life engaging in commerce. Granted, some people still do, but that means they have to leave the sanction of society's laws and protections and engage in dangerous behavior. They have to go seek it out, and that filters out many people from ever being presented with the temptation of ever getting involved with something like that in the first place. And so, we'll move on. Quote, secondly, we may impose a severe and regular order upon ourselves in regard to the satisfying of our appetites. By thus regulating the impulse and limiting its ebb and flow to fixed periods, we may obtain intervals in which it ceases to disturb us. And by beginning in this way, we may perhaps be able to pass on to the first method, end quote. So that's the method of schedule, the regularity of fulfilling an impulse. I might say that we all do this insofar as, so we have a cultural convention of regular meal times, right? Or on the individual level too, where people manage their own diet. People engage in intermittent fasting or dietary plans. You only eat certain foods, or only on certain days and times do you indulge a certain amount of time, right? It's a regulation. There are parts of Northern Europe where it's appropriate to get absolutely wasted on the weekend, but drinking on a weekday is seen as just totally degenerate, right? We also tend to think of there being certain appropriate times of day for drinking. Some people make the distinction between the proper time to drink beer versus liquor. And so we might consider the ways in which American drinking, just historically, American drinking culture became dysfunctional when we had the introduction of distilled liquor for a couple reasons. But one was that it's hundreds of times more powerful than the table beers people would drink at the tavern. The tavern culture was a drinking culture, but one which was communal, in which people, the convention, you purchase rounds of drinks, everyone drinks together, you drink when people make toasts. It's a very different kind of experience from swigging moonshine alone in your cabin. And it's that type of drunkenness, right? The day drinking, liquor drinking, solo drinking husband who abandons his family or abandons his responsibility. That was what fueled the push for prohibition of alcohol in America. But such a thing would have been probably inconceivable in the 18th century, when the primary forms of drinking were social, and the pubs were the centers of American communities and centers of political organizing even, and the hub of social relationships. And so by putting the satisfaction of an impulse into a schedule, or regulating it in some way, making there be some sort of social ritual involved, one can keep what's maybe a normally harmful or dangerous impulse in its proper place. It becomes manageable. You still feed it, but only at the proper time. And so, and then Nietzsche imagines you can maybe start out here on method 2, and then transition to not feeding the impulse at all. Maybe once you master the compartmentalization of a drive, as we call it, you can proceed to total avoidance of it. Okay, third method, number 3, quote, in the third place, we may deliberately give ourselves over to an unrestrained and unbounded gratification of the impulse, in order that we may become disgusted with it, and to obtain by means of this very disgust a command over the impulse, provided, of course, that we do not imitate the rider who rides his horse to death and breaks his own neck in doing so, for this, unhappily, is generally the outcome of the application of this third method, end quote. The third one's pretty funny to me because, as Nietzsche admits, this doesn't seem to be a very successful strategy, generally speaking. It usually ends in one's downfall. Maybe we could compare this to what alcoholics call hitting rock bottom. So, that's the thing, though. I don't think any alcoholic, or any recovering alcoholic anyway, will ever recommend to you that you should hit rock bottom. The right way to deal with your addiction is to hit rock bottom. It may be the only way that some people come face to face with the ugliness of their condition, right? Nietzsche calls becoming disgusted with the drive. And this can very well be the impetus for a change. But a lot of really horrible, tragic things can spur you on to change, right? It doesn't mean we should try to destroy ourselves or wish to face horrible hardships. It doesn't make that a viable or an advisable strategy, really, is what we should say. It may be viable. It's probably not advisable. But nevertheless, Nietzsche lists it here because he means this to be an exhaustive list. I mean, remember, he says he sees no more than these 6 methods. So this is a method. And it does seem to sometimes work. Sometimes you need to indulge fully, follow the drive through to its excessive conclusions, and until the disgust sets in with the drive and with yourself, and hope it doesn't kill you. But most of the time that doesn't happen, and it means your own destruction. Okay, next one. Quote, "In the 4th place, there is an intellectual trick which consists in associating the idea of the gratification so firmly with some painful thought that after a little practice the thought of gratification is itself immediately felt as a very painful one. For example, when the Christian accustoms himself to think of the presence and scorn of the devil in the course of sensual enjoyment, or everlasting punishment in hell for revenge by murder, or even merely of the contempt which he will meet with from those of his fellow men whom he most respects, if he steals a sum of money, or if a man has often checked an intense desire for suicide by thinking of the grief and self-reproaches of his relations and friends, and has thus succeeded in balancing himself upon the edge of life. For after some practice, these ideas follow one another in his mind like cause and effect." End quote. I will say very quickly, this, I think, is one of the more interesting aspects of Nietzsche's advice or his methods here, is that he points out, and I think this is true, that you can make such mental associations automatic. You could argue that that's what religion does, or what moral systems do, or what culture does, what morality does, what the herd morality, the voice of conscience that we all have, right, associates praise with certain things and shame with other things. And that this is, importantly, it becomes automatic. And so it's an intellectual trick because rather than just having this inculcated into you unconsciously, making the conscious choice to fully make that association to the point where it becomes automatic. And so it is a method. You may be thinking, because I've said, oh, thought doesn't control desire, it doesn't control will. How can it be an intellectual trick? It is intellectual, but the real trick is in creating something which happens spontaneously or automatically through practice, basically, right? Practice of associating shame with certain things, or fear of punishment with certain things. Okay, continuing. Quote, "Among instances of this kind may be mentioned the cases of Lord Byron and Napoleon, in whom the pride of man revolted and took offense at the preponderance of one particular passion over the collective attitude and order of reason. From this arises the habit and joy of tyrannizing over the craving and making it, as it were, gnash its teeth. I will not be a slave of any appetite," wrote Byron in his diary. End quote. So again, the intellect can play a role here, but not in the manner we normally think of the intellect taking control of the moral process as by an act of free will. Because what we're doing here is it's the use of the imagination, usually powerfully enhanced with religious imagery or religious sentimentality, to bring something before our mind's eye, some self-reproach or the thought of eternal punishment in hell, some sense of shame or judgment. And the examples Nietzsche uses he talks about the Christian milieu a whole bunch, but I mentioned Islam before, and it certainly qualifies as well. In fact, there's a series of phrases a Muslim can bring to mind to remember always, the fact that death can come at any time, And if one dies doing something sinful, right, that will be a shame forever on your conscience, something which you'll be judged for eternally. The recitation goes as follows, quote, "Let us not forget that we are Muslims. Let us not forget our relationship with Allah Most High. Let us not forget that death can visit very unexpectedly. Let us not forget that there is accountability. Let us not forget Jannat, paradise. Let us not forget Jahannam, hell," end quote. And in the Pali Canon of Buddhism, we find something similar. This is in the Upajhathana Sutta. That was so funny. I think I'm going to leave that in, me struggling to pronounce that. Okay. It means the subjects for contemplation sutra, or sutta or sutra, depending on whether you're speaking Pali or Sanskrit. And there's a recitation in there called the 5 remembrances. It's a practice that Buddhists are advised by the sutra to perform every single day. And it's supposed to focus them on their task, of getting out of samsara, getting salvation from their karma. So these remembrances are supposed to refocus you, refocus your will. And so, in the course of life, your will may be variously aimed at all sorts of distractions or short-term goals or desires that may seem important now. But the point of this is to say what's really important is, the Buddhist goal of liberation, right? And so it's that same problem we've been talking about of the wayward will and finding a method to bring it back into focus. And so just as with the sort of Muslim remembrances we just talked about, the 5 remembrances that I'm going to read are sort of the Buddhist version of that, of strategy number 4. Quote, "I am sure to become old. I cannot avoid aging. I am sure to become ill. I cannot avoid illness. I am sure to die. I cannot avoid death. I must be separated and parted from all that is dear and beloved to me. I am the owner of my actions, heir of my actions. Actions are the womb from which I have sprung. Actions are my relations. Actions are my protection. Whatever actions I do, good or bad, of these I shall become the heir." End quote. So I see these parallels from Buddhism and Islam as comparable to the Christian in Nietzsche's example, bringing to mind the fires of eternal hell and punishment that the devil will visit upon him as a means of suppressing or pushing down a sinful impulse. And notice in these religions, they advise you to do these remembrances on a daily basis so that it becomes automatic, so that it doesn't have to be a matter of your intellect squaring off against the will, because that never works, right? It has to, it's an intellectual trick, as we said, tricking the will into making a sort of association. Interestingly, Nietzsche cites Lord Byron, who wrote in his diary he would not be the slave of any appetite. But for Byron, so he means appetite very literally in that passage. He didn't just mean an appetite in the sense of, my appetites, my vices, right? Any pleasurable appetite. He means his literal appetite, which Byron was at war with his whole life. Byron was probably bulimic, anorexic, or both, and his weight fluctuated dangerously throughout his life. He may have actually ended up shortening his life, or he contributed to his early death due to his own ill health when I think he actually died from getting leeched too much. I don't remember exactly, but at the time he was already very unhealthy because of his eating condition. Apparently he had this sort of, pallid, pale, thin look that became somewhat fashionable. So it actually spread Byron's pathology with food and eating to the broader high society, creating a trend of young men adopting Byron's diet, which I think was rice and vinegar and nothing else. So a lot of this for Byron may have actually been psychological, springing from his perception of how his mother viewed him. He had a very unhealthy relationship with her, or just a negative self-image. But needless to say, he was actually not doing a good job of controlling an appetite. Maybe in the literal sense, yes, but not in terms of controlling an unhealthy, excessive drive or desire. Because the unhealthy desire, in this case, was actually an eating disorder, right? What would have been good for Byron would have been finding some way of defeating that vehement drive, defeating the eating disorder that shortened his lifespan. So Nietzsche's example is actually a little off base, in my opinion. I actually wrote a whole section about this in my book, by the way, so it's fun to bring it up here. Napoleon, I think, is a better example of what Nietzsche is talking about, who he also brings up. Napoleon was famously, he's a disciplined but also a passionate man. He's the proof that he's a strong will is in the pudding, so to speak. Became perhaps the most successful general of all time. And Napoleon, rights of having to reign in or dominate over himself, tyrannizes over himself, as Nietzsche writes. Okay, the next one. Quote, "In the fifth place, we may bring about a dislocation of our powers by imposing upon ourselves a particularly difficult and fatiguing task, or by deliberately submitting to some new charm and pleasure, in order thus to turn our thoughts and physical powers into other channels. It comes to the same thing. If we temporarily favor another impulse by affording it numerous opportunities of gratification, and thus rendering it the squanderer of the power which would otherwise be commandeered, so to speak, by the tyrannical impulse. A few, perhaps, will be able to restrain the particular passion which aspires to domination by granting their other known passions a temporary encouragement and license in order that they may devour the food which the tyrant wishes for himself alone." End quote. So this becomes, what he's talking about here is sublimation. Whether we deliberately throw ourselves into a surrogate pleasure, you take the energy for one drive and push it into another, or as he says in the first example here, we set ourselves some exhausting task, which takes up all our energy and leaves none for anything else. As a creative person myself, I certainly can attest to how having some sort of creative venture or pursuit can distract you from all of your, if you really get engrossed in that and take that seriously, yeah, you can use that. It's why some people, I think, are workaholics too, in their job or in their career, because it allows them to distract themselves from all their distractions, we might say. So Nietzsche says this is appropriate only for the few who can, simply let their other passions take the reins, and naturally then deprive the other impulse that they don't want to indulge in any attention or nourishment. I'm referring to here when he says sort of a few will be able to restrain the particular passion by granting other known passions a temporary encouragement, right? In actual practice, for most of us to use that method, they'll probably, I think, have to compel themselves by circumstances to not have the time or effort to fulfill the problematic drive at all. So one example might be what I just did. I went on tour with my band for 3 weeks on the West Coast. So on tour, we drove every day, anywhere from 4 to 8 hours. In a couple cases, 10 or 14 on one drive. You get to a new city, you have to go to the venue to load in gear, usually immediately. And then you find food, or, sometimes you find the time to take a rest. And then the show happens, and then you're done at 2 or 3 in the morning. And then what follows is either driving or rest, or both, and then the whole thing starts over again. And so the image of a touring musician as a party animal, which was created by the likes of Motley Crue, for example, it's not really entirely accurate to the average touring musician. It's actually a lot of work, and what a lot of people like about it and why they find freedom in doing that is that you're completely absorbed with one task which demands all of your attention, and you have very few opportunities for distraction. And so the reason why most musicians aren't party animals on the road, though, isn't because musicians aren't prone to alcoholism and drug use and all of that bad behavior. The reason is that for most of the time, you don't have the time or the energy to do any of that. And it's really the rich and famous musicians who are usually the ones ODing in the bathroom. It's why success kills people, right? Or the example I said before of Jordan Peterson saying when an addict comes into a lot of money, it's really bad for them. That happened to quite a lot of few famous musicians. So maybe it's all too complicated of an example to go into. I don't know if it makes as much sense as I think it does because I have experience with it, but and I know it's different for everyone. I know plenty of musicians who have had drug problems or alcohol problems anyway. But maybe a better example. So I have a couple friends I've known who have done this for a summer. They've gone up to Alaska to work on a fishing boat. Fishermen too, they're not known for being strangers to drink and hard living of all kinds. But when you're out on the boat, you don't really have the opportunity for that kind of thing. You work long hours, you're tired all the time, and for the most part, your day-to-day grind is intense work with no time or energy for, cutting loose at all. And so, what they've told me is like, yeah, you can save a lot of money going up and working on a fishing boat because all you do is work, right? Use a more positive example. Some people who struggle with depression or anxiety are often helped by finding some hobby, some project to invest their effort into. This is probably the most basic sort of example of what we're talking about. And what could, you could argue that what's happening there, the mind's drive to constantly worry or to constantly think negative thoughts or to visualize the worst that can happen or entertain endless notions of self-loathing, that's something that requires energy or nourishment. And the more you get stuck in those cycles of thought, the stronger they become. So what shakes people out of this is simply the investment of energy into some new thing, exercise or photography or whatever. It can really be anything. I think this qualifies for Nietzsche's fifth method. You set yourself some big task or even just a hobby, just actively pouring your energy into something as a means of starving out the other drives, including whatever the one is that's a problem for you. Okay, quote, in the sixth and last place, the man who can stand it and thinks it reasonable to weaken and subdue his entire physical and psychical organization, likewise, of course, attains the goal of weakening a single violent instinct, as, for example, those who starve their sensuality and at the same time their vigor and often destroy their reason in the bargain, such as the ascetics. End quote. The last one I think is explained very well by Nietzsche's example. We can call it the ascetic method. Weaken the problematic drive by weakening the whole self. Weaken all the drives. Starve them all. If you're hunting down your quarry in the forest, this is the method of just napalming the forest. Rather than investing your energy in a task that allows you to starve the other drives, or by sublimating, here we just find the method, remove them all. And so it does come to a place of rejecting the world entirely. That's why it's appropriate for the ascetic, neglecting and starving the body entirely. And that's the method of hygienic practices and religious diets and sexual abstinence, shunning of money and property. We talked about asceticism quite a bit recently in the podcast, but so, there's a whole episode on the ascetic that you can look at, or listen to rather, but maybe this time we'll just, we could consider the list of renunciations undergone by Thai forest monks. So in addition to all the things that normal Buddhists and even other monks renounce, Thai forest monks also do things such as like sleeping on the forest ground or wearing only discarded clothes, eating nothing but plain rice and so on, or eating only begged food. And this last method, of course, calls to mind the quotation from elsewhere in the book, Daybreak, or Nietzsche says, the ascetic method is preferable only for those who experience a tyrannical drive as insatiable and insurmountable, right? He says that the ascetic method is appropriate for such people, but only for such people. For such people who can never be at peace, can never be in control of themselves. The deadening of the entire organism is the only appropriate strategy. And it is a powerful one, but you see what you're trading to in order to do that. And so we get to the conclusion of the passage. Quote, hence, shunning the opportunities, regulating the impulse, bringing about satiety and disgust in the impulse, associating a painful idea, such as that of discredit, disgust, or offended pride, then the dislocation of one's forces, and finally, general debility and exhaustion. These are the 6 methods. But the will to combat the violence of a craving is beyond our power, equally with the method we adopt and the success we may have in applying it. In all this process, our intellect is rather merely the blind instrument of another rival craving, whether it be the impulse to repose, or the fear of disgrace and other evil consequences, or love. While we thus imagine that we are complaining of the violence of an impulse, it is at bottom merely one impulse which is complaining of another, i.e. the perception of the violent suffering which is being caused us presupposes that there is another equally or more violent impulse, and that a struggle is impending, in which our intellect must take part. End quote. And so the final note is a reminder that the intellect is merely an accompaniment, being driven itself by one drive or another, It's not an autonomous or divorced entity from the competing drives. In fact, the situation is that it's a drive fighting another drive, and the evidence is that you feel divided, is what Nietzsche says. The fact that you feel divided is evidence that there's another drive competing with the one that you consider to be a problem, the drive whose vehemence you are opposed to. To conclude here, I want to note what the underlying principle is behind all of Nietzsche's enumerated strategies. That's the principle of nourishment. Nietzsche's insight here is that in all the methods for combating a vehement drive, the effectiveness arises in whether or not we succeed in depriving the drive of nourishment, or regulating what nourishment it gets, or taking its nourishment and putting it elsewhere. All these methods either directly or indirectly aim at this goal. We may recall that other passage from Daybreak that we've discussed before, entitled What We Are Free to Do, which describes the self as a sort of garden of impulses, some of which we water and some of which we let starve. And so, just like ourselves, the aggregate of these drives, we're not static things, neither are the drives themselves. They're growing living things, and so we can kill them, or deaden them to the point of irrelevance, or grow them. The problem, of course, we don't simply decide to do this by thinking. So perhaps a better metaphor then is not that of a garden, right? Because then the question becomes, who is the gardener? But perhaps we should simply consider it like a war. Competing enemies attempt to cut off one another's supply lines. That's what wins or loses wars, after all. Supply lines. It's why wars are fought. It's why wars are won. Resources. As Napoleon said, an army marches on its stomach. And so you win a war by starving the enemy and by cutting them off from their nourishment. And so with that principle in mind, we can then approach the problem of governing the self. And I mean the practical problem. That by indulging in an impulse, we enhance it. And by starving it, we diminish it. To combat a drive, we have to cut it off. But how to manage this may require we take a less direct route, but we still have to acknowledge that it's nourishment that keeps these drives going. And so, that might require that we sublimate, or that we put ourselves into novel circumstances, or avoid opportunities. Or even there's the counterintuitive case of indulging so heavily that it becomes disgusting. But as for a universal prescription, Nietzsche has none. And how could he? Discovering what will work in your particular case will require self-experimentation. And that can take months or years or even a lifetime. As a final thought, I'm going to read one of my favorite paragraphs of all time. It's from William James. He lays out more or less a comparable view to Nietzsche's, and he speaks from a psychological basis. James outlines why it is every little nourishment of a habit, as we put it, is incredibly important, and that this is really what we're talking about in terms of practical ethics, rather than the dramatic moral decisions that people talk about in ethics class, like the trolley problem. You have to decide between killing one person you love or 5 people you don't know. It's this momentous moral decision upon which so much hinges, which you are now confronted with and you must give an answer to. The real activity of morality has nothing to do with this. What shapes who we are, and thus how we behave, is habit. And habit is shaped by a million little decisions. And we tend to devalue these and consider them inconsequential. Instead, we're always obsessed with these grand moments and grand narratives. But it's the little moments that define us. And that's what James talks about here. Quote, "The physiological study of mental conditions is thus the most powerful ally of hortatory ethics. The hell to be endured hereafter, of which theology tells, is no worse than the hell we make for ourselves in this world by habitually fashioning our characters in the wrong way. Could the young but realize how soon they will become mere walking bundles of habits, they would give more heed to their conduct while in the plastic state. We are spinning our own fates, good or evil, and never to be undone. Every smallest stroke of virtue or of vice leaves its never so little scar. The drunken Rip Van Winkle in Jefferson's play excuses himself for every fresh dereliction by saying, 'I won't count this time.' Well, he may not count it, and a kind heaven may not count it, but it is being counted nonetheless. Down among his nerve cells and fibers, the molecules are counting it, registering and storing it, up to be used against him when the next temptation comes. End quote. All right, that's all, everyone. Thank you for listening. I'm very glad to be back home. We recently got 1,000 listens in a single day here at the Nietzsche podcast. And that may not sound like a lot to everyone, but it's a lot to me. And it's way more than I'd imagined when I started my silly little, podcast about a German guy with a big mustache. But I'm so glad you're all here listening, and I love all the feedback I get. I read it all, even if I don't respond to it. And I swear that Q&A 3 is coming soon. I've had a hectic couple weeks again. But content will be churning out, I promise. Patrons will get it sometime this week or next week. The rest of you will get it in 2 or 3 weeks. And then I have some special stuff that's a little different from what the podcast usually is coming soon. I've already kind of hinted at what it is. But anyway, that's all, everyone. This is Keegan, signing off. If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it, or on social media. Thank you for your support.